Hello everyone and welcome to this audio podcast. This audio podcast is part of the Calyces Chronicle series. This audio podcast is part of the this audio podcast is part of the MaelZtorm Cortex. This audio podcast is part of the Labanostics analysis, and this audio podcast is part of a Storm Labostics production. This audio podcast will look into the sort of conclusion, and sort of the sort of conclusion aspects to this works. So chronic illness not only affects the young person or youngster, but his or her family members also. Each chronic ailment encompasses diverse challenges, and it's probable that different sort of surveys or measures are required to effectively assess various aspects of a disease to draw more concrete conclusions about how young people, how a young person, how young people with CKD cope. And there are several peer-reviewed works or publications that give further insight into assessing quality of life. For example, which a quality of life around youngsters or young people, which although differs from coping, from looking at coping, quality of life can provide a sort of a basis. Unfortunately, the information surrounding coping to support young people with CKD pre and post transplantation, for example, has not been sort of delved into detail. And coping for youngsters or young people can include managing symptoms undergoing invasive forms of renal replacement therapy, tolerating everyday regimens or treatments, dealing with restrictions and hospital appointments. So with regard to the aims, the literature review highlighted that young people with CKD live with the actual or threatened loss of impairment of body functioning, and including sort of weakness, lack of energy, or impaired cognition. Youngsters or young people with CKD can experience a loss of interaction, loss of membership in groups, frustrations in around their and plans for their future, difficulties in school and academia, as well as marked challenges in around relationships in around relationships and living with CKD in particular, and specifically CKD stages 4 and 5, for example, therefore has consequences for young people in a number of dimensions which transcend pathophysiological abnormalities, making coping with this chronic illness or this condition challenging. And there has been research exploring or looking into coping in other illnesses, and these have highlighted positive coping behavior is related to better physical outcomes amongst those with chronic illnesses or chronic diseases. At present, there is a perception that CKD only occurs in the older population. When clearly this is not the case. More research needs to concentrate and focus on young people's ability to cope at different ages and cognitive development. For example, strategies for a three-year-old will have different requirements than a 15-year-old. The coping processes and strategies utilized by youngsters or young people with CKD have not been established. It could be detailed. It could be that detailed methodologies of deducing, encouraging and undesirable undesirable trials relate to a young person's lifestyle. For example, it may be that emotion-focused coping relating to injury ultimately increases the probability or the likelihood of depressive feelings, because a youngster may be less emotionally equipped to interact, and this often leads to us to feelings of despair. Quality of life at the same time, quality of life has amongst the evidence and in the literature is a broad concept encompassing a variety of dimensions, whereas coping is thought to be more specific. It is important to stress that current research involving young people with CKD, especially CKD stages 4 and 5, have been limited or insubstantial. Searching through abstracts and papers over a 34-year duration or 34-year period had highlighted that coping-based research in young people had been insubstantial. And what is most needed is to describe what a young person with CKD is thinking and doing in the effort to cope with stressful encounters. Much of the research conducted surrounding young people with CKD involves assessing quality of life and collecting quantitative data. Any evaluation of current approaches in understanding how a young person copes needs to consider the provision for them to rate healthcare to rate healthcare. So these findings are the findings from this review. This works as peer review works indicate that in the literature, and referring back to the aims of referring back to the aims of the review, there have not been enough data collected using qualitative methodologies to understand whether or not the coping strategies or processes adapted or helpful, and what coping actually means to young people with CKD. Although some references cited in this work may be quite of late, this really emphasizes that research surrounding coping in young people with CKD has been a very under-researched area, with only one single publication exploring, for example, transition to adult services for children and young people with renal failure. That draws this audio podcast to a close. This has been audio podcast as part of the Calyces Chronicle. This audio podcast has been a part of the MaelZtorm Cortex, and this audio podcast has been part of a Labanostics analysis.